Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. It's Friday, May 3rd, 2019 in Calne, Wiltshire. A quiet English street. A school day that should have looked ordinary. A packed bag near the door. A half-eaten breakfast. A calendar full of exams. When Ellie Gould doesn't show or respond, concern escalates into a welfare check. The house is secured, doors intact, no sign of forced entry. Officers clear the rooms the same way they clear any suspected homicide. Hands gloved, voices low, body cameras steady. One detail lands early. There's an empty slot in the kitchen knife block. From the outset, procedure drives the tempo. The first officer notes ambient conditions: lights on, windows latched, sink damp. A quick sweep preserves the scene for CID and forensics. This is not a burglary gone wrong. There's no ransacking, no obvious theft, no pry marks. The clock matters more than speculation. Investigators begin building a narrow window. Ellie was expected at school, messages stopped, and routine patterns, walks, rides, calls, simply cut off. In towns like this, murder doesn't just violate the law. It tears at the fabric of a place that runs on predictability. The forensic lens takes over. Entry appears non-forced, suggesting familiarity or consent. Inside, the home weapon use is flagged. It almost always points to immediacy rather than planning. Scene control tightens, cordon tape, exhibit logs, photographs from wide to tight, then numbered markers. The team catalogs footwear impressions, latent prints where viable, and any visible traces that survive a basic visual, always with the same discipline: observe, record, secure. No dramatic leaps, no invented motives, just a family home holding answers in plain objects. Detectives extend from the house to the clock. Who had access this morning? Which friends were expecting Ellie? What messages were sent or left unsent? Phone activity will speak, so will the absence of it. The route between school and home is mapped by camera coverage and habitual paths: front doors, bus stops, corner shops that run CCTV on short loops. The aim is simple: anchor Ellie's last safe minute to something verifiable. An image, a tap, a timestamp. There is a human center to this, and it deserves respect. Ellie is 17, daughter, student, teammate, friend. The initial briefing doesn't traffic in rumor. It protects the victim's dignity and the integrity of the case. When officers step back from the kitchen, the gap in the knife block isn't just a clue, it's a boundary. Whatever happened likely happened fast, and it happened inside. By dusk, the working theory is tight enough to pursue but not yet to announce. Houses don't lie, people do, and the data will start aligning soon, sometimes too cleanly. That, as any investigator will tell you, can be part of the problem. The scene is sealed. Now the clock has to speak. Investigators treat time as evidence. They begin with the ordinary things that should have happened on a Friday in May: attendance at school, a planned lift, routine messages. When those fail to occur, the last safe minute becomes the anchor for everything else the case will do. Phone records are pulled first, not guesses, logs. Who texted Ellie that morning, what was read, what wasn't, and whether any outgoing message came from her or simply from her device. Friends expected to see her at school. One expected to pick her up. That ride is canceled by text from Ellie's phone. The wording is neutral, almost clipped. Investigators note it because neutral language isn't proof of anything, but it's often how misdirection tries to pass as normal. From there, the map replaces the calendar. Teams canvass the corridor between house and school: doorbell cameras, corner shop CCTV, bus stop domes. Coverage isn't perfect. Suburban England rarely is, but short loops are enough if the timing is tight. They pull a sequence of neighborhood clips: deliveries arriving, a dog walker at a regular time, a car idling at an intersection that usually stays empty. It's not a movie. You don't get the whole path. You get fragments that either help or hurt a story someone will later tell. Wi-Fi and router logs add texture. If a phone stays home, the handshake lingers. If it leaves, the pattern breaks. That morning shows a narrow gap. Messages taper, expected movement doesn't resume, and there's no legitimate reason for a student in exam season to suddenly go dark. The window of opportunity compresses from hours to dozens of minutes. In cases like this, that is the difference between speculation and direction. Next come the human timestamps. Teachers mark an absence that isn't typical. A classmate remembers a small plan about lunch that never happened. Family recall an ordinary morning, not an argument. These are not character sketches, they are clocks with faces. Investigators chart them on a wall, calls in black, camera hits in blue, device events in red, so that, at a glance, they can see where the day should have been and where it really went. As that wall fills, a pattern forms. Someone had time to enter, commit a fast, focused assault, and exit before a flurry of checks began. No break-in, no rummaging, no long presence. The likely profile is not a stranger. It is proximity. Someone with access, someone expected, or someone who believed they were. That isn't an accusation. It's the physics of the window. The shorter it gets, the more it favors familiarity. Detectives begin structured interviews. They don't ask how anyone feels about Ellie. They ask where you were, who can verify it, and whether your device supports your claim. They compare clothing described in interviews with clothing seen in any camera frame. They listen for routine details that don't survive a timestamp, the "I was revising" line that can't be backed by a device active where you say you were. None of this is dramatic on paper. It's just how cases turn. There's a small pause built into this process that matters. Every name on the board is a person with a life beyond the timeline. The aim is to be fast, but not reckless. That's why the team leans on verifiable signals more than impressions. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. When you advance a case, you don't shred more fabric than the offender already did. By late evening, the last safe minute is hard enough to withstand court scrutiny. The ride was canceled. The phone behavior is off-pattern. The neighborhood path has gaps but not holes. A narrow group around Ellie fits the window. Most begin to fall away under simple checks. One timeline doesn't. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, and sometimes that was the point. For you watching, this is the turning point you rarely see on a headline. It's not about drama, it's about sequence. You can argue with opinions. You can't argue with the clock. The time window is tight. Now the science has to hold it. The postmortem answers the two questions that matter at this stage: how Ellie died and what the scene says about the person who did it. Pathology is direct. There are signs of neck compression consistent with manual force, followed by multiple sharp force injuries concentrated at the neck. The pattern is clustered, focused, and delivered in a short interval. The wounds are counted and documented with photographs and measurements. The count is significant because it indicates persistence, not a single defensive slash. Cause of death is recorded as sharp force trauma to the neck with evidence of prior compression. Manner is homicide. The wording is clinical on purpose. This is a legal record as much as a medical one. Forensics turns to the tool. The likely weapon is a kitchen knife taken from inside the house. That matters. Offenders who arrive without a weapon often rely on opportunity and access. It suggests haste, proximity, and confidence that entry would not be challenged. The missing slot in the block becomes more than a detail. It connects a domestic object to a lethal outcome. Examiners test for trace transfer, residues, and any cleaning artifacts in the sink area. The aim is to link a specific blade to specific wounds, or at least to rule out alternatives. Scene processing documents limited disturbance outside the area of assault. No ransacking, no search pattern, no theft footprint. That narrows intent. This was not a burglar who panicked. This was contact inside a familiar environment. Blood distribution supports a fast, targeted attack near a fixed point, not a chase through rooms. Spatter analysis is kept simple for court. Angle ranges, directionality, and low to mid-height patterns that are consistent with a brief struggle and rapid escalation. There are indications of post-offense manipulation. Investigators note an attempt to stage the scene to confuse intent, placement of an item to suggest self-harm, and signs of quick cleaning. These are not guesses, they are entries in an exhibit log matched to photographs. If the washing was partial, micro-traces can still survive along seams or in drains. Footwear becomes critical here. Shoes can carry the story the scene is trying to hide. Diluted blood in tread, wipe marks inconsistent with normal wear, and transfer not visible to the eye under ordinary light. Digital forensics complements the physical picture. Router logs help place a device in or out of the house at key minutes. If a phone was used to send a message, examiners look for typing patterns, app switching, and any biometric behavior relevant to who likely composed it. The purpose is narrow. Attribute the act of messaging and align it with the physical events in the kitchen. When message timing overlaps the attack window, it doesn't answer who by itself, but it shows purpose. Someone was managing perception while managing a crime scene. The investigative tone stays even. Ellie is not reduced to a case number. She is a 17-year-old killed inside what should have been a safe place. The most respectful way to tell her story is to get it right. That means reporting what the tissue, the tool, and the timeline prove, and cutting out speculation that does not survive a lab bench or a courtroom. With cause and manner locked, the profile sharpens. The offender had access without forced entry, acted quickly, used a household knife, attempted limited cleanup, and tried to redirect suspicion with a message. That combination points away from a stranger and toward a known contact. It also changes the order of interviews. Detectives move people with legitimate access to the front of the line. Their alibis will be checked against device movement, router presence, and any camera frames on the likely approach and exit routes. If clothing was changed, if shoes were cleaned, if items were discarded, those acts leave secondary scenes, in drains, in bins, at woodland edges. The search parameters expand accordingly. One line stays on the briefing board. Houses don't lie. The fabric of the home, the blade block, the sink, the floor, records choices in a way memory often won't. In towns like this, the aftermath is personal. Neighbors know each other's routines. Schools feel the empty seat. Families want meaning. The job is not to offer meaning. The job is to deliver a record strong enough that meaning isn't built on a guess. The takeaway tonight is clear. The clock told us when. The body tells us how. Together, they tell us what kind of offender we're looking for and who we're not. Next comes the part that closes cases, aligning a single person's movements, devices, and statements with the facts that do not change. If you've been following closely, you can feel the direction of travel. Access, speed, familiarity, and staging are not random features. They're a pattern. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. More often, that's how you know you're on the right track. We have a secured house and a confirmed cause of death. The next move is to let the devices speak. Phones, routers, and neighborhood cameras don't have loyalties. They keep time even when people don't. The team builds a clean sequence: what was sent from Ellie's phone, when the home network saw her device, and who moved through the streets around her address in the narrow window we've already established. The message canceling a planned ride is the first test. Examiners image the handset and extract basic metadata: send time, app pathway, and whether any authentication changed that morning. The goal isn't to prove authorship from a single field. It's to see if the event lines up with the rest of the day. The timestamp lands inside the critical interval. That places a composed, outward-facing act during the same period a lethal assault occurred inside the home. It doesn't tell us who typed it. It tells us someone managed appearances while the house turned silent. Next comes network presence. The home router log is simple but useful. It shows when known devices connect and drop. Investigators compare those entries to the phone's local records. If the handset remained in the house when the cancellation went out, that points to an offender using the victim's device on site. If the device left and reconnected later, timing still matters. Either way, the message wasn't an ordinary running late. It was a tool. Camera work is less glamorous than people think. You don't watch one perfect feed, you chase fragments. Doorbells, shop fronts, school corridors at the edges of town, short loops that overwrite every 24 or 48 hours. Officers fan out and pull windows, bracketing the incident. A neighbor's bell camera catches a figure on foot at a time that fits our window. A few streets away, a low-resolution shop camera sees a teen-sized silhouette pass by with pace, not a stroll. You can't make an identification off a blur. You can plot a direction and a duration. The sequence tightens when you align the path with the map. From Ellie's street, there are two logical ways to reach woodland and water where people often stash things they don't want to carry home. That's not a theory. It's a pattern that repeats in cases across small towns. Teams push out on those spurs with a targeted search plan. Grates and drains first for items washed or wiped, bins along the path, then the fringe of the tree line. They're not looking for a weapon from elsewhere. This case points to a kitchen knife from inside the house. What they're hoping to find is clothing or footwear that tells a second story. Blood diluted by rinsing, soil inconsistent with a claimed root, fibers that match the house. Meanwhile, the handset extraction gives something else: app-switching behavior and short bursts of activity that don't look like a student getting ready for class. Tiny windows, Open, type, close, amid a morning that should have been routine. Again, none of this proves a person by itself, but stacked with the router presence and the camera fragments, it starts to show intent. Control the narrative, exit quickly, leave as little trace as possible. Statements are checked against this silent record. If someone says they were revising at home, the question is where the device placed them. If they say they walked a certain route, officers look for that body shape on the appropriate camera at the appropriate minute. If the clothing they describe doesn't match a captured frame, that discrepancy gets flagged for a follow-up search, laundry, showers, and any trash runs that day. You can fake a text. It's harder to fake where a device actually was. There's a human reason we stay this methodical. Ellie was 17, a daughter and a classmate with a normal Friday ahead. The best way to respect her is to let the facts hold. When a life ends inside a family home, the community feels it deep. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. That's why restraint matters. We're not here to name a culprit in the first half of a story. We're here to earn the moment when the evidence leaves no other explanation. By nightfall, the data story is coherent. The cancellation from Ellie's phone sits inside the lethal window. The home network and the handset agree on presence during critical minutes. Neighborhood cameras give a viable approach and exit path for a teen. The search team has clear priorities for drains, bins, and woodland fringes. Interviews now run with a sharper edge. Claims must meet clocks. One timeline still doesn't. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. More often, it's how you know where to look next. With the device timeline locked and a probable approach and exit path mapped, the work turns to people. Interviews aren't about feelings, they're about clocks and claims. Detectives bring in the small circle defined by access and timing. Classmates, close contacts, anyone who expected to see Ellie Gould on that Friday in Calne. Each conversation follows the same spine. Where were you? Who can verify it? What were you wearing? And does your device agree? The ride cancellation from Ellie's phone is the first pressure point. Friends describe the message as plain and out of character for a day stacked with exam prep. Investigators don't ask them to read intent, they ask them to confirm time and expectation. The timestamp is already in the file. What matters now is alignment. Several friends expected to meet Ellie, and the canceled plan cuts across that expectation without a follow-up call or explanation. It's a clean contradiction with routine. From there, the interviews move into detail. Clothing is logged, tops, shoes, jackets, so those descriptions can be compared to camera frames and to any items the search teams lift from drains, bins, or the woodland edge. Officers ask about laundry done that day and the day after. Sudden loads, quick showers, or items missing from a usual rotation get noted. None of this proves anything alone. Together, they test whether a story survives the evidence. A teen within Ellie's circle gives a timeline that sits close to the attack window. The account is careful but leaves gaps. The teen says they studied, took a walk, and then went about an ordinary afternoon. Investigators compare those statements to device activity, home router presence, and the neighborhood camera fragments already gathered. If a claimed walk matches the mapped route, a body shape should appear on a camera within a narrow minute range. If it doesn't, that absence is an exhibit, not a hunch. There are fresh marks on one interviewee, thin, recent, in places you would expect during a short, violent struggle. The explanation offered is recorded verbatim and held against the pathology report that documents neck compression and clustered neck wounds. This is where process protects fairness. The marks are photographed, measured, and the explanation is preserved without commentary. Later, the lab will tell the court whether those lines make sense. Midway through the interview cycle, the search teams bring in potential evidence from the route toward the tree line. Items of clothing consistent with teen wear, damp and partially concealed. They're bagged and booked with location and time. Examiners will test for diluted blood, trace fibers, and contact transfer from surfaces inside Ellie's kitchen. In a case like this, you're not hoping for dramatic finds. You're looking for small things that don't belong together, house fibers on outdoor fabric or residue that survived a rinse. Detectives return to the same interviewee with a sharper set of questions. If you were wearing X, why does the retrieved item match Y? If you walked here, why is there no image of you at the camera that covers that path? If you studied at home, why does your device geolocate near a route that ends at Woodland Edge? Each prompt is narrow. Each is tied to a timestamp or a recovered item. When accounts shift under that pressure, the transcript shows it. The house, meanwhile, keeps giving fixed points. The missing kitchen knife shapes motive and means. This was a fast, close assault with a tool already inside the home. No forced entry means the front half of the suspect pool is made of people with perceived permission, invited, expected, or able to arrive without alarm. The staged element, managing the lift by texting from Ellie's phone, adds purpose. Whoever did this wanted time and wanted to control what others saw. By evening, the friction is obvious. Most timelines hold. One does not. The same teen, linked by proximity and routine, now sits against a wall of small, stubborn details. A text that buys minutes, a route that leads away from the house when alarm should have gone the other direction, marks explained in ways the pathology doesn't support, and clothing questions that don't settle. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Here, it narrows the field to one door. There's a human duty in how this step is handled. Ellie is not an abstraction. She's a 17-year-old killed inside her home. Her family, friends, and school deserve a record that a courtroom can trust. That's why detectives keep the tone cold and the scope tight. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The best repair you can offer is a case that doesn't collapse under argument. By the time the interviews close for the night, the next procedural step is clear. The person whose account fails the clocks will be asked for clothing, phones, and shoes under lawful authority. Search warrants will follow the path the cameras and devices drew. You don't get many second chances on evidence like this. When the window is tens of minutes wide, precision is the only way you close it. The timeline holds, the pathology holds, and the device map holds. That is enough to move from interviews to legal action. Detectives draft warrants that target what actually answers questions. Footwear, outer layers worn that morning, any bag used on the route toward the tree line, and the phone tied to the statements that don't match the clock. The tone stays steady, no assumptions, just the evidence needed to test a single account against a single day. Seizures come first. Shoes are lifted, packaged, and booked. The tread is photographed before swabbing so the lab can read the story in layers, visible material, diluted residue inside the grooves, and cleaning patterns that don't fit normal wear. Clothing taken into custody gets air-dried and paper-bagged to preserve trace. The suspect phone is imaged under warrant. Messages, app switch intervals, and location artifacts are pulled with the same care used on Ellie Gould's device. If the handset was wiped, that fact is an exhibit. If it wasn't, small fragments often remain. Keyboard caches, notification traces, and map tiles that reveal where the device actually traveled. Search teams execute in parallel. Drains closest to the house are opened and filtered. Bags left on the woodland spur are recovered with a simple question in mind. Do these items belong to the teen at the center of the interview? Contradictions, and do they carry the house on them? Fibers, residues, or diluted blood consistent with the kitchen area? When you work a short window, you don't chase every possibility. You follow the path the data already drew. Back in the interview room, the story is tested again, now against seized items. If a witness claimed to have worn one set of clothes but the lab receives another in their size with fresh washing signals, detergent concentration, residual moisture, the conflict is logged. If the person said they walked a specific route at a certain time, camera frames are lined up to those minutes. An absence on a camera that should have seen them is not speculation. It is a documented gap. The small injuries recorded earlier are rephotographed to capture age progression. The pathology report remains the benchmark for whether those marks make sense. The strongest piece today is alignment. The cancellation text from Ellie's phone sits inside the attack window. The router shows presence on site. The camera fragments map an approach and exit consistent with a teen leaving fast. And now the seized items begin to answer a simple question. Who carried the crime scene away on their shoes and clothes? You don't need a confession when the exhibits agree with each other. By late afternoon, officers brief the senior investigating officer. The threshold for arrest is met. Reasonable grounds, rooted in material facts. Custody is handled by the book. The teen at the heart of the contradictions is detained. Shoes, clothing, and the seized phone remain with forensics. Separate teams continue the grid around the woodland edge for any remaining disposals. Receipts, packaging, or wipes that can extend the chain of acts after the offense. There's a responsibility that comes with this step. Ellie is 17, and so is the person now in custody. Families on both sides are about to be pulled into a process that moves slowly in public and quickly in private. That's why precision matters. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The repair starts with a file that will stand up in court, timestamps that don't bend, artifacts that don't contradict, and a route that explains how a quiet house turned into a homicide scene without a single broken lock. What happens next is standard but decisive. Samples from footwear and clothing go on a fast track for presumptive tests, then confirmatory analysis. The handset imaging is parsed for typing behavior around the ride cancellation text. Any recovery from drains or bins is compared to fibers from Ellie's kitchen. If those links hold, the interview that follows won't be a conversation about feelings. It will be a walk through minutes, objects, and choices. One line from the board stays with me. Clocks don't forget. When they all point the same way, custody isn't a guess. It's the next lawful step. Custody turned into a charge, and the case moved where every decision is weighed on paper. Bristol Crown Court. The file did the talking. Cause and manner were not in dispute. Neck compression followed by multiple sharp force injuries to the neck. The likely weapon came from the kitchen inside Ellie Gould's home. There was no forced entry. The timeline placed a cancellation text from Ellie's phone inside the attack window. The home router showed presence during critical minutes, and neighborhood cameras outlined a teen-sized approach and exit in a time frame too tight for a stranger scenario. Items recovered along the mapped spur, footwear and clothing, were examined for trace consistent with the kitchen environment and post-incident washing. The picture was coherent. Prosecutors laid out the sequence without dramatics. A short, focused assault inside a familiar setting. Evidence of staging, a message sent from the victim's phone to control who would come looking and when, and the placement meant to mimic self-harm. Signs of quick cleanup and disposal of items along a predictable route out of Calne toward Woodland. Fresh marks documented on the defendant after arrest, photographed, measured, and assessed against the pathologist's account of a brief struggle and lethal force. You didn't need a flourish to connect these exhibits. You needed a clock and a kitchen. Defense counsel had limited room. The defendant was 17 at the time of the killing. No weapon was brought to the house. It was taken from within. Those facts mattered for sentence, not for whether the act happened. Under UK law, the youth of the offender does not erase culpability, but it does shape the minimum term. Where a case is built on clean, converging evidence, the practical decision is a plea. That is what happened. The defendant pleaded guilty to murder. No jury sat for weeks. There was no split narrative and no second ending. The court moved to sentencing with a record that was cold and complete. The judge identified aggravating features you would expect: an attack in the victim's own home, attempts to stage and mislead, and the impact on family and community. Mitigation turned on age and the fact the weapon was taken from the scene, not carried in. The sentence was life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years and 6 months before parole can even be considered. In plain English, this is a life sentence. The earliest possible review is after serving that minimum. There's a reason to state it this clearly. Cases like this break small towns, and rumors take root when the record is muddy. Here, the record is not muddy. One location, one sequence, one offender, one sentence. No alternative version waits in the wings. The data that carried us from the house to the map to the custody suite is the same data that anchored the plea and the penalty. Ellie Gould was 17. Her life ended in the place that should have been safest. A respectful telling doesn't try to manufacture meaning. It honors the work that holds people accountable. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The repair begins with a sentence that fits the law and a record strong enough to teach, so we recognize risk earlier in teen relationships and act before harm is done. From a production standpoint, this is the pivot from investigation to consequence. The remaining story is aftermath and prevention. The domestic homicide review, what local services learned, and how policy discussions, often summarized as Ellie's Law, sought to raise the floor for sentencing starting points in youth-on-youth domestic killings. We'll cover that next. With the same restraint we've kept from the first minute, the court phase ended without drama. Thomas Griffiths, 17 at the time of the killing, pleaded guilty to murder at Bristol Crown Court. The judge imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years and 6 months before parole can even be considered. No split narrative, no maybe ending. One offender, one sentence, rooted in a file that never contradicted itself. A fast, focused attack inside Ellie Gould's home in Calne. A kitchen knife taken from that kitchen. Staging designed to delay discovery. A route out of town that explained the quick exit. The same clocks and artifacts that carried the case from front door to custody carried it to judgment. What followed was not spectacle but review. Wiltshire's domestic homicide review looked past the headlines and asked harder questions. What were the early signals in a teen relationship that adults and peers could have recognized? How do schools, health services, and police share concern quickly when something shifts from ordinary to risky? The recommendations were practical. Teach young people what coercive control looks like in real time. Treat sudden isolation, device misuse, and out-of-pattern messages as red flags rather than teenage drama. Make it simple for friends to raise a concern without fear of overreacting. None of this changes what happened to Ellie. It changes how fast we respond the next time a story starts to look like this one. The case also fueled a sentencing conversation often summarized in the media as Ellie's Law. The point wasn't to rewrite history, it was to ask whether starting points for youth offenders in domestic killings reflect the harm done, especially when staging and misdirection show planning after the fact. Policy moves slowly and must account for age, rehabilitation, and proportionality. But the debate itself had value. It told families their questions about consequence were being heard, and it told communities the system was willing to re-examine its own floor. At ground level, the impact was immediate and personal. A family lost a daughter. A school lived with an empty desk. Friends had to carry the weight of a text that was never truly hers. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The respectful way to tell a case like Ellie's is to keep faith with the record and to make something useful from it. That usefulness lives in small decisions. A teacher who pulls a student aside after noticing control in their messages. A friend who doesn't explain away new bruises or sudden secrecy. A parent who treats a canceled plan sent from a child's phone as a conversation to have, not a box to tick. Prevention isn't abstract. It's practical prompts we can act on. If a partner takes or uses your phone, that's not care, it's control. If someone tries to isolate you from friends and normal routines, that's a warning, not a phase. If a message arrives that doesn't sound like the person you know, check in voice to voice. If you're worried and don't know where to start, tell an adult you trust at school or in your family, or contact local domestic abuse support services. Small interventions early are how quiet houses stay safe. Before we close, it's worth doing what good investigators do. Verify once, then stop. This case is the United Kingdom, not the United States. The homicide occurred on Friday, May 3, 2019, inside Ellie Gould's home in Calne, Wiltshire. The weapon was a kitchen knife from that home. There was no forced entry. The offender was Thomas Griffiths, then 17. He pleaded guilty to murder and received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years and 6 months. There is not a second version of these events. There is the record and the responsibilities it leaves with the rest of us. Ellie was 17. Her life should be remembered for more than the worst thing that happened to her. The most honest tribute we can offer is accuracy and the will to act when we see patterns forming. Clocks don't forget. When the data point in one direction, the answer is not doubt for its own sake. It's the courage to move before harm becomes irreversible. That is where we leave it. One home, one sequence, one sentence, a quiet town that learned to look closer, and a promise to recognize control early, to intervene sooner, and to keep the places that should be safe exactly that. I've told this case in the plainest way I know because accuracy is respect. If there's one lesson, it's this. Control isn't love. When someone grabs your phone, cuts you off, or rewrites your plans, speak up and step out. Ask a friend, a parent, a teacher. Small moves early save lives. What warning signs did this story make you notice? What would you do differently next time? If this episode helped or if it missed, tell me why and where you're watching from. Take care of your people. Check in when a message feels off. For more clear, humane true crime, please subscribe so you don't miss the next case.